Here's the question: how can we serve innovative voices, smart ideas, and the latest technology to improve brand identity, product consistency, and profitability in the print and packaging supply chain? Welcome to the Idealliance GAMUT podcast, and I am your host, Jeff Collins. Idealliance is a nonprofit association, and we serve the global supply chain for brands, print, and packaging with 12 offices located around the world. If you are interested in becoming a member of Idealliance, you can join us by visiting our website at idealliance.org. On today's GAMUT podcast, we have a very special guest from Google, Marco Ugolini, and he works in color and print and packaging for Google. And Marco has an amazing story to tell, and you get to hear it today about his journey before the desktop revolution, before Photoshop, working with iconic photographers like Bruce Weber, clients like Calvin Klein and Ralph Lauren, as well as brand agencies and design agencies like Lander and Associates in San Francisco. So stay tuned. Marco's also a G7 expert, and he explains the value of G7 and gray balance and tonality and good contrast and the principles he learned early on in producing great photography and great images. Marco, thank you for joining us on the GAMUT podcast today. And before we get started, I just want to thank you and thank Google for allowing you to share your journey, your experience within the industry. I mean, you were at the forefront at the beginning of the digital transformation of print, design, and in particular photography, and it's where you got your start. And you have worked for some amazing iconic pioneers within the industry on all sides, all aspects. We talk about the print supply chain, but you have lived and breathed the print supply chain as well, working again, like I said, and I'll let you tell your story, but our listeners are in for a treat, a historical treat. So thank you again.
No problem. Thank you for the opportunity.
Starting out before, well, we'll just kind of benchmark the time and date stamp without giving out our actual ages, and we'll talk about early days of before.
I can talk about my age. It's going to be obvious.
Yes,
I was in my 20s in the 80s.
Okay, there we go.
Early 30s in the 80s. So people can do the math.
That's funny. We're definitely a little bit older than the average Photoshop user nowadays. And I guess to get started, why don't you tell us about your journey, your career before the desktop publishing revolution, the digital transformation in photography, before Photoshop and Google became part of the English lexicon.
Yeah, I started in the late 70s, late 1970s. I started being interested in photography. That was a completely new thing for me. Nobody in my family or nobody very close to me had similar interests. Although I had seen photographs and I had known people who had a passion in photography, I developed a passion of my own for photography. And then I met a local graphic artist who was very renowned, very successful in my part of Italy where I was at the time. Mm-hmm. I lived in Italy for the first 29 years of my life. And this guy was a friend, and he was a good photographer. And one day he was just holding a class in photography. And so I said to myself, man, I want to go. So I started dabbling with photographs. I bought a very bad camera, but it was enough to learn, and I took it from there. And then 4 years later, I moved to New York City, and by then I had developed skills in darkroom techniques. Mm-hmm. And I became I got a job in a photo lab in Midtown Manhattan at 46th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. and that place was called Lexington Labs. I don't know if you ever heard of it, but it had some renown in those days. The biggest client there was Bruce Weber, and so I was with Lexington Labs and working mainly for Bruce Weber. Actually, I did black and white photography for myself and for Lexington Labs. I was the person that did pretty much 70% of the black and white work. There was another guy, but he didn't do Bruce Weber. I did everything by Bruce Weber, including the film. He would come in, Charlie, his assistant, would come in with bags of 220 film and drop them in my lap, and I had to go and develop them and make contact sheets and so forth. And then printed stuff. But it was pretty exciting because in those years I was fresh in New York. I was just there in this lab with glamorous people, really. Calvin Klein would come for a party every once in a while or something. Peter Beard was one of our photographers. Peter Beard, quite a character. I love his work. I love him as a person too. And so I was doing all this work, and it was fantastic, really. Bruce is a pleasure to work for. Always very, very, very enthusiastic and appreciative. Great guy. So there I was, and also on the side doing work for myself, my own photography, which was pretty much in the style of street photography in the tradition of Dion Arbus, Robert Frank, Gary Winogrand, people like that. And so, yeah, those years were very formative for me. I was there at the Lexington Labs until about 85, 86. I forget exactly when. And then I left. I went to work for another much higher level place, Schneider Erdmann, down in Cooper Square. That was quite a fancy place, right? Quality-wise, quite a step up. One of their clients was Bruce Davison, but I was not working for him. I did some little work for Marianne Mark there, David Castorine, and names like that. I was very busy developing my own style and developing my own aesthetic, really, by doing this work, which was very it depended. Some of the work was easier, some of the work was harder. The work for Bruce was in the middle. Some of the things I did for him were kind of hard because they were so underexposed, and so I had to learn some tricks. So I learned all these fundamentals. I knew nothing about print then, of course. Right. Other than print in the darkroom, I knew nothing about any other print, offset or anything. So what I did was just create photographs on paper. On a photosensitive paper.
We're talking about silver halide, right?
Silver halide, yeah. It was Ilford Gallery paper, basically. I see. Most of the time, yeah. And so I worked mainly, almost exclusively with Charlie Griffin, who was the assistant for Bruce. And he was the one that came in with the film and picked up the prints and gave me directions from Bruce whenever there was a redo or something that needed to be changed a little bit here, a little bit there. But most of the time, it was a very pleasant work environment with Bruce. Always very pleasant for me. So what I developed in those years was an eye for what looks right and for what looks wrong. I'm very demanding of myself. So whenever I saw something that wasn't right, I tended to see it. I didn't have to have somebody else tell me. I knew it was wrong. So sometimes I wasn't sure, but I kind of solidified my aesthetics. Yeah, my sense of judgment, visual judgment. So those years were very important in that way. So, and especially with Schneider Erdmann, man, those guys were demanding.
And
not in a bad way. Not in a bad way. I love the fact that they were so important in my personal development as a visual. Gary Snyder was particularly strict, but in a good way.
When you say strict, what did you learn from that type of environment where you have a much higher sense or level of perfection?
With Gary, you never got away with anything. That's what I got from it.
No shortcuts.
And,
yeah.
Right there and then, I kind of felt, all tense and anxious. But, in retrospect, that was like, Marine training.
I think I understand.
So with Gary, it was all about the fullest dynamic range. The blacks have to be clean. The whites have to be clean with just a hint of a tone. There cannot be any pure white in the print. It's got to have a minimum of tone. All those principles I learned, and they are all directly later. In hindsight, they're all directly transmissible to print. Little area coverage and minimum dot.
Yeah,
that's exactly the same thing.
Yeah. So what you've described to me is the essence of what we, or the principles, I should say, of G7. We're looking for a high dynamic range, very, very good tonality from the minimum dot all the way to the darkest shadow. So we have great contrast throughout the tonal range. And this is the same concept or principle for black and white photography as it is with G7 and 4-color reproduction.
G7 is that, really. G7 is about tonality, contrast, and the very bones of what makes an image.
And, bones is a great analogy. It's something that we say quite often, that gray balance in G7, tonality and contrast is the backbone of good image reproduction.
Yeah, so not to make a long story too long, there was an interlude. I in 87, 88, I was with Schneider Erdmann for about 2 years.
Yeah.
And I left because my back was just killing me. and so I couldn't stand being in the darkroom anymore. It's a kind of a lonely job. I had enough of it. So I wanted to move on to something else. And for a while, I was doing what at the time in the late 80s was called desktop publishing, right? But then when Photoshop started coming out, as a photographer, I looked at Photoshop and I went, oh, photography with computers, right? And by then I had a Macintosh already. I was literate in computers. We're talking about the beginning of the computer era as we know it these days. The late 80s is when I bought a Macintosh, so with Photoshop, I started messing with it and saying how it dealt with the principles of photography that I knew, and I was immediately smitten because this program, coarse as it was, before Photoshop 2.5, I believe there were not even layers.
I remember those days. We were working with the SciTech systems to do essentially what Photoshop was trying to do. And within a few years, we were using Photoshops on Mac, and those very expensive SciTech workstations like Prisma were no longer useful. Definitely not economical compared to buying a copy of Photoshop.
This is something that in the darkroom I would have died for. Immediately, I saw the potential. I knew that this program, this application, Photoshop, at the beginning of the 90s, would grow to be a monster in power and possibilities. I knew it. So, and I was right, because right now, in this time and age, Photoshop is the best tool I know anyway. Yeah, I've heard about possible alternatives, but I'm not sure about them. I'm gonna study the situation, but we'll see what happens with the other applications that are trying to usurp Photoshop. But I saw immediately what this thing was going to do for images and imaging. And I knew that the darkroom was gone, finished, that the future was there in front of us. And always been very enthusiastic about innovations in computer technology such as this. I'm also an avid music enthusiast, and I think that music has never sounded better than today, in the sense of the sound of it, the way the purity of the sound, not so much the quality maybe, but the quality of what gets put out, except a few rare exceptions. But the quality of the sound is just fantastic, right? And the same with the quality of the images. What we can do today with images is quite astounding.
And Marco, what I find interesting about your career is that your work in the early days with Photoshop, you were at Landor and Associates in San Francisco, and Landor and Associates, Walter Landor, is an icon in design and advertising and branding for some of the major retail brands like Coca-Cola and more. For our listeners, Google Landor and Associates or Landor San Francisco, Walter Landor. It's quite an amazing history within the graphic communications industry. And I would love if you could share your experiences at Landor in the early days of Photoshop and the digital transformation.
I started working with Landor Associates I left New York in 1994. Mm-hmm. And then I started working with Landor Associates in San Francisco. And immediately I was put to use, I was the Photoshop guy there.
Right.
And I was using 2.5, and it didn't have layers. It was really painful. Then it had layers. It was much better, so on and so forth. One thing that I banged my nose against again and again was this mystery that everybody was presenting me with a print. This shrouded in mystery and magic, right?
Printing. You're talking about all the different. Everybody has their own special sauce on how they reproduce print.
Straight what it was, Well, how is it done? Oh, let us do it. You don't touch it. We do it.
Yes.
Okay. And soon enough I realized that what was coming back was not what we wanted. So we're talking 95, 96, 97, 98. And I was disappointed. I said, there must be a better way to get results like I want them, or like we want them.
Yeah.
There's no way to predict here. Everybody does what they want. And things can come out darker, lighter, redder, bluer, greener. And we have to find out a way to make this work. So in 97, 98, I started hearing of the color sync technology from Apple. So I started attending the color sync user group meetings in Cupertino.
Is this before Seabolt was launched, or Seabolt's going? Yeah, this is.
I think.
Yeah, I think it's around the same time.
We're talking late 90s, right?
Late 90s.
These meetings in Cupertino. Yeah. So people like Bruce Frazier were there, and talking directly about these new technologies, And Bruce was explaining how color management works. That's the first time I heard about color management, right? So late 90s, I started dabbling in it, and by 2000 or so, I was pretty good at it. With Bruce's help. Bruce was not exactly a close friend, but he was friendly, and I was able to ask him questions, and he would answer me. So that was quite a privilege, I always look back with fondness.
Bruce Frazier. Yeah, you're talking about...
Bruce Frazier was just a lovely person.
It's amazing listening to your story, Marco. You mentioned working directly and collaborating with people that, for our listeners who don't know, these people that Marco has worked with, and Bruce Frazier in particular, again, are pioneers in our industry. And it is today what it is because of their contributions, including yours, Marco. I just want to let let our listeners know who Bruce Frazier is to pay homage. He passed in 2006, and Bruce was an internationally renowned Photoshop trainer. He worked on the alpha and beta of Photoshop, and is, again, a pioneer in the digital transformation and digital imaging and photography around the world.
So Bruce Frazier and other people who at the time were in the forefront of the new ICC color management movement, if you want to call it. So I started feeling more confident. At a certain point, I was able to make color management into the work at Landor. And we bought a Spectrolino, the noisiest machine on the planet. Very noisy, very slow. But it was a start. And then we bought a RIP. We started making proofs. So whoever starts out in ICC color management, you need patience and dedication. Okay,
sure.
And long studying. You have to study deep and slowly. At least I had to, and it will not come to you easy. You have to work for it, but the results are worth the effort. Absolutely. So from this far end where I am now, I look back and I see all those years as an investment in in the skills that I have accumulated over the years. Which. Yeah. I think are useful to places like my current place of employment. And I am in charge of color and print at Google packaging. So that is something that fills me with pride that I was able to be of value to a company like Google.
Wow, very nice, Marco. And I was listening. I was thinking about how someone like yourself, coming from a high-end brand or ad agency, creatives, working with these top legendary people and photographers, and how you became so knowledgeable about the print side of the process. How did you start? Did you take a class? Explain to our listeners your journey on the print side.
Well, I had to figure out things one step at a time. So I figured out the basics of print, right? By reading that book. I never remember the title. That tiny book where all the terms of printing are explained. I forget it.
Yeah, your Pocket Pal.
Yes, yeah, that one. Everybody had it. That was my first introduction to the mysteries of print. Pretty much. Whenever I didn't know some terminology, I looked it up there. Remember, we didn't have the Google search engine.
No, back then, every pre-press department, you couldn't, you walk into a commercial printer and you'd probably find a copy of the Pocket Pal laying around somewhere. No doubt about it.
Pocket Pal was very important to me. It was there were a few other books like that, but I've always been self-taught in my life, and but I've made up for that with a voracious appetite for information. And so whenever I couldn't find an answer, I looked for it, and I usually found it. So bit by bit, I understood the basics and what makes print. I understood the concept of taking an image, making a screen, separating the colors, angles, print angles, dot size. So I slowly understood that all of this was not a mysterious, mystical thing.
It's a scientific process.
It was a very practical, physical thing that could be controlled. So that was my revelation in the early 2000s. Really, I went through this transformation where from somebody who tried tried to let them do their job and I do mine, which was to make good-looking images, I started saying, I have to take more responsibility for what I give them. Mm-hmm. And that will only make things better because many of them are like me. They don't know everything. Although they want to make it look like they know everything, they don't know everything, right? And so why not work together to make something good, right? So I took it as my responsibility to provide the best files that I was capable of providing, which is a principle that I apply to this day. Mm-hmm. So that was my angle. So from that point of view, I started. I've also had a freelance career on the side. I left Landor in 2003, and from 2003 to 2012, I was freelancing. So during that time, I was able to grow my skills by trying things out, finding better ways to do the same thing in the ways that were more economical and solid. So, for example, I learned how to create my own ICC profiles for output. Mm-hmm. For any given situation. I would get a client that would print something at a local printer. I gave him a TC. No, it was not a TC, but it was a ITA.
ITA, yeah.
Or an ECI 2000. What is it, 2000?
Yeah, 2002. ECI 2002, ITA 875.
I would give that to them. I would say, printed with no color management. Don't put any changes into the file. And then I would make a profile. And I would separate, and then I gave it to them, and things came out great. So that demystified everything for me. All of a sudden I saw this mysterious thing dissolve in front of me, in the sense that it was not mysterious anymore. It was a thing. It was like, the light in the darkroom, right? The light, the paper. How does it work? It works. You do it right, it works. So there's then I learned a few tricks on my own. I have a few ways of doing things that are not necessarily in wide adoption, but there are things that I use all the time. For example, there's one thing that I discovered a long time ago, and I still use to this day, is this thing that I call max K separation. It's not exactly max K the way, if you took it literally, it's not that. It's right. It's a high black generation. So when you separate, and I've been doing this for now more than 10 years. Every time I create a custom profile, I do not even bother with a regular normal GCR or whatever. Mm-hmm. I don't. I separate so that CMY is always lower than K, pretty much across the board.
Right. You have a heavier black compared to your CMYK separations.
Yeah. If you look at the in Chromix color thing, for example, right? You look at the relative colorimetric net neutral curve. You will see the CMY below a pretty much straight K. Mm-hmm. So why is that important? For two reasons. Because it does not affect the apparent depth of the image. If an image is dark, there's a misconception that in order to give it visual weight, you have to add CMY. It's not true. There's a point at which adding CMY adds trouble, but not visual depth.
Understood. Yeah.
Yeah. So a good balance of a decent amount of CMY plus K gives you the same visual depth, the same L value, for example, as is a different separation with less black and more CMY. But what is the second advantage of that? Okay, you don't lose any dynamic range. You really don't. It's hard for people to believe, but you don't lose dynamic range.
Got it. Yeah.
And the second thing is a bonus that I have never been able to live without, which is the print is more stable.
Absolutely.
Because neutrality is preserved. You can make moves in CMY and not affect neutrality as much as you would by having higher CMY and lower K.
Exactly. Obvious. Yeah.
Obvious. So I was talking to Dave Hunter at Color 20 a few days ago, and other people there, and I said, do you use anything other than high black generation? I think it was David.
David
I don't want
Hunter's,
to be wrong.
Yeah, that's okay.
I think it was David. And I think he said something to the effect that, no, it doesn't really make sense to use anything else. I think he said that.
So he validated what you said, yeah.
Yeah. So because, I'm never 100% certain that what I do is the best possible way. I try to keep that humility about what I do. I don't have all the answers, and my practical guidance is you don't necessarily have the best possible answer, and there might be something you can still learn, obviously. So ask questions, and ask questions of people you appreciate and are in your high esteem, like Dave and Don Hutchison and Ron Ellis, with whom I have started to connect. I haven't asked this question of Ron or Don, but this thing with Max K that I call Max K is something that I don't see any reason not to use.
I absolutely agree. And, looking back on Photoshop and what you were talking about as far as doing, working in a dark room for Bruce Weber. And now we look today at solutions for color management and color separations. And it is, we should be very proud of how far we've come. And sometimes I don't think we take the time to pause to reflect back on the huge advances that we've made within this sector as far as technology. We look at cloud solutions now, color management in the cloud, doing verification of brand colors instantaneously from the press through the cloud to the brand or the buyer for approval now. And you're talking about separating and black and black generation. And we have really smart algorithms and AI technology to do ink optimization for a variety of different conditions that make sense. We were on a conversation. I had a conversation with Thorsten Braun and his wife Barbara on Color Logic solutions and some of the advances that they have. It's absolutely amazing how far we have come.
At Color 20, I met Thorsten. He's a great guy, and his products are great. I use his software right now for I use Colorant.
Colorant, yeah.
Yeah, one thing that I want to increase my expertise on is device links, because for things like what you are talking about, device links are definitely the thing to do.
Absolutely, Marco. And I want to shift gears a little bit based on a conversation that I had with another major brand, Under Armour, on our podcast. We discussed how they handle their digital assets. Do they use a pre-media company, or do they communicate and handle the transfer of the artwork to the print service provider directly? And if they do they convert and prepare the files and convert them to Grackle 2013 and they do the separations themselves? Or do they allow the print service provider to handle that? A lot of them do. And to some degree, they have issues because there's issues with communication. And I was wondering what your particular policy is when you transfer and provide your artwork to your print service providers.
Yeah. We don't release anything that is not fully separated to basically the standard Grackle 2013 CRPC 6 at this point. Mm-hmm. So it's fully separated with my custom profile. And because I create the mass scale version of Grackle 2013 using Copra, things go out of here into the vendor's hands, and it's good to go into the plate making. That's it.
I understand.
There's really nothing to do there other than possibly, I don't know, laying out things on the form. That's it.
And what value does targeting a G7 data set bring to what you're doing? Where's the ROI and going that direction versus something that's an alternative?
Well, there's a complication in the work that I do currently, which is lamination, right? Lamination puts a kink in the works. But G7 still works. You go for G7 targeted before lamination to hit the solids and the overprints, and then once you got the primaries and the overprints within the targeted tolerance, then you laminate, and then you curve that. And then you have a G7 workflow. It's not perfectly column managed because on top of that, you should do really a color space custom CRPC, right? But things are difficult when you deal with many vendors and of varying quality and capability. And so one thing about scaling a work that is so massive, like what we do here, is that you have to be carefully gauging and dialing in all the variables, and being that you have to go for what is feasible.
Exactly.
I would love to do color space. I would love to do color space, but color space requires a level of proficiency and reliability and stability that we are still working towards. So,
got it.
You have to be. That's one flaw that I see. Honestly, I love Idealliance, and I appreciate what you guys are doing, but I think that many people are just. They show a qualification on the wall, but then you ask them to do it and they seem to fumble.
Absolutely. And like any quality management program that printers have, a lot of time there's cultural change that hasn't taken place to be able to sustain the level of quality that they could do when they had originally implemented it. And of course, there's companies that have adopted a full cultural change as far as quality is concerned, adopting lean programs and things like that. And they are very, very successful. And some of them are multi-billion-dollar packaging suppliers. Now, you yourself you're a certified G7 expert. What value did that course bring, and what light bulbs went on, or did it was really from your background? It's really a confirmation process when we talk about those core values of tonality and gray balance.
Yeah, I joined Google after I had worked at Nest for Tony Fadell's company.
Nest.
Between 2012 and 2017, I was there. And there, things were smaller, right? So I was not using G7 at all. But then I come to Google in November of 2017, and one of the things that I immediately saw was that my Nest ways, I'm not going to work here. I no longer have just a little bitty thing that can be done on one press, always the same press, always at the same vendor,
Yeah.
I have to think bigger, and I have to think of something that guarantees quality, but is, as they say in these marketing terms, scalable, right?
Yeah.
So massively scalable, because we're talking about big print runs. So things have to be managed and prepared cautiously, and in ways that don't require custom treatment for each location, right? Yeah, which is something that I did at Nest, but I can't do here. So everybody gets the same files, right? But then they have to play the game by the rules. Now we're playing Major League. So in November of 2017, when I joined, I took a quick look and I said, okay, this is what I'll do. The first thing that has to happen is that I have to become a G7 expert, which I was not at the time. So they said yes, to their credit. And I went to LA to Don Hutchison's training in December of 2017. I became an expert in January. I put in my exam and I passed. So, and then from then on, I tried to think, and because when you become certified, you don't become an expert instantly, right? You still have to figure out, okay, now I get this tool in my hand. What do I do with it?
It puts it puts you in the saddle. It gets you in the saddle. Yeah. But you got to ride. You got to keep riding your horse by yourself.
From the left, from the right, from the bottom, from the top, and you go, okay, how does this work? Fine. Don said all those interesting things, but now how do I really make it work? So I had to figure out all the procedures, all the steps, all the things that I was going to ask the vendors to do to make this thing a reality, right? And so so one of the things, there are some bottom lines here that cannot be changed. Like, for example, everybody has to do 300 lines per inch. I'm not talking about pixels per inch. I'm talking about lines per inch.
Yeah, LPI.
Very, very high line screen frequency. Why? Well, because in the highlights, you don't get the peppery effect of 175 or 150. And it's smoother. If you do it right, it's smoother. So, and then there are other rules, like slowly, all images have to be done in 16 bits. I'm a strong believer in 16 bits. Unlike other people I could mention, but I don't want to. I have a long feud with somebody whose name is widely known, but and he's a big enemy of 16 bits and color management.
We will mention his name. I get it. Yeah,
you can guess who it is. But so I'm a big believer in 16 bits because when it comes to shadows and gradients, there's nothing like it.
Yeah,
you work in
smooth
16
transitions.
bits, it is smooth. Even when you convert to from 16 to 8, there's an burnt-in dither that does miracles. It's really the best shadows, the smoothest, best shadows and gradients you can produce. But you have to start in 16 bits. So those things, right? Certain rules on the vendor side, like when you say that you can hit a 1% dot at 300 lines per inch, the dot has to be on the plate. Not only on the plate, it has to be on the page, on the sheet. Okay, it cannot disappear. So all these things. So one thing about all this, about G7, about color management, that cannot work unless you do something about it, is not technical. Of course, there are the technical things, but one thing is not technical. One thing is human. Management has to be on your side. The vendor's management has to be on your side. They have to commit to doing what it takes to provide, to give you the results that the technology requires. Without doing that, the results will be touch and go, chance. Because if the management doesn't tell the people on the printing floor This is not a joke. You have to do this. It's not left to your decision whether you do this or not. You do it.
And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. And as a print service provider, we want to, expand our capabilities. And if a buyer or brand puts in front of us a challenge, and we can meet that challenge, we gain your trust and we gain your business and we become a partner because we're serving your needs. It's as simple as that. And we often find print service providers don't measure and monitor their quality capability, and they end up getting themselves into relationships where they can't deliver the customer's expectations.
Exactly. One main requirement that the management has to guarantee is that the quality is consistent, meaning no matter who's on press, the results don't vary by more than the acceptable tolerances. Okay? Mm-hmm. So it cannot be up to shift number 1 to be the star, and then shift number 2 and number 3, usually there's 3 shifts a day, to be the ones that can't cut it. Go
ahead.
You never know when the prints that you need will be done by shifts 2 or 3, right? You don't want to be, I want it only done by shift number 1.
I remember those days. Yeah.
So they have to be the people in the pre-press room and the people in the print room have to be able to. People in the pre-press room have to be able to make plates whose dots are the dots that should be, not plus or minus 4, plus or minus 1 maybe.
So, looking at vendors, your print service providers, what are some of the attributes that you look for before you consider providing work or engaging in a partnership?
You have to use good materials, starting with the inks. They have to be ISO 12642. At this point, I can't accept anything other than. And then in the pre-press room and on the printing floor have to be qualified. The facility has to be G7 Master Color Space. At this point, I don't accept anything lower than that. Not only they have to be G7 Master Color Space, but they have to have their internal people. Preferably 2 people in the print room who are G7 certified experts.
Understood.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. And they have to be the people who do the work. They cannot hire somebody from outside and get that thing that they put on the wall that says G7 Master Color Space. It cannot be that.
Understood. You need to. I get it.
Yeah. We want to see a G7 Master Color Space qualification that is achieved by your own means. That is really important. And then we want management to be on our side, saying you guarantee the stability, the repeatability, the consistency that we need. I want to put in place a situation where all the vendors are capable. I'm trying to make things go from earlier ways to a manufacturing model, where things are done according to manufacturing procedures. Mm-hmm. Some people might hear that and go, "Oh my God, that's awful. They're taking the humanity out of it." No, not really, no. because the results will be beautiful. How is that taking out the humanity? And you know what I mean? When something, my responsibility. If I had to encapsulate my responsibility here, is to make things look beautiful. Okay? So the designers I work with, they want the things that they work on so hard to make them look beautiful on the page, on the sheet. Mm-hmm. And it's my job to make that happen. The manufacturing model, in my opinion, and I'm open to discussion, but it seems to me kind of an obvious thing that the manufacturing model will do that.
Marco, you're preaching to the choir. I wholeheartedly agree with that statement. And if we look at artists, the famous artists, and they create artwork that's beautiful. It's perennial. But what people think, I think, is a misperception is that, because of the word creative and artist, they think that there's no process involved. And in fact, it's absolutely a process involved, especially if we look at the education history of the masters. There's a process very similar to manufacturing processes that are involved. And I remember watching a documentary on PBS not too long ago about 3 sculptors, and they were discussing their processes that they used to develop their art. And I saw the consistency in the way that they approached each one of their projects. It was very similar to watching and working with, engineers that are in, prototyping and the process of developing a new product or invention. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with implementing processes that make the product consistent to meet the needs of the customer. Let the customer be creative, you deliver, and to deliver consistently, you need to take a manufacturing approach to it, is basically what I'm hearing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean, because I am that way about my work, my own photography. I have a body of photography, and I am absolutely committed to the best possible visual quality for my work because I want my work to look beautiful. Okay, and the more I know about the technical side of it, the more my work will look the way I want it. Mm-hmm. So, when people, it's a romantic misconception to say that technique takes away the humanity. It's so wrong. It's not true. I'm a strong believer in the power of technology to create beauty. Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing that can convince me that getting more stability in printing detracts from the craft. I mean, people who are craftsmen, the best craftsmen in a manufacturing process are a pleasure to behold. You look at these people and you go, my God, they're good, right?
Right, absolutely. The standards are a backstop. They're guides to continually better the manufacturing process. That's the craftsmanship part of manufacturing, is continually improving the value stream. And then we get into the area where automation is a bad word. When we look at improvement of processes and solutions, we have technology that is fully automated, and a lot of the time people perceive that as a job killer. And companies I've seen that take a different approach to the word automation and a word of process improvement, where they're looking at it as what's the value stream, and taking out non-value add steps and touch points through automation or better technology doesn't necessarily mean that we're killing jobs. What it means is that we're able to use people in a value add capacity. And because of that, the business will improve, sales will improve, the company grows, the business grows. So it's a win across the board for everyone.
Earlier times, right before the car came around, right? Mm-hmm. Lower Manhattan was a pigsty. Yeah. Covered in tons of horse dung every day. Oh. Incredible amounts of disease and rodents and infestations. And you can't keep horses around just because it's more natural. Going the way of the car made sense then. So I'm saying that things that opposing what is a move forward in the name of values or perceived values of the past doesn't make sense. And in print, I don't know what this will mean for print. I cannot really, I don't know what it will look like in, 15 years. I have no idea. What kind of processes will be in place? Mm-hmm. It's hard to think that what we have today will last much longer.
Most definitely, we're already starting to see some of that come to life with smaller sensors, smaller spectrophotometers, possibly in mobile phones and that type of thing. And ICC Max, which is a new flavor of and a huge improvement to the current ICC standard. And if we look back on what you were talking about, when we look at manually exposing film and all the steps, on a stripping table that we took, and you compare that to what you're talking about with Photoshop.
Well, due to my background, once in a while I can't help look back at the old days and go, my God, what I'm doing today here in 1 hour.
I know.
It took me a couple of days to do in the old days.
Yeah.
And not only I'm saving time, but the quality is so much better. It's exactly like I want it, and it will be exactly like I want it every time I print. In the darkroom, one thing that in the darkroom I was faced with every time was, for example, I make a print today for I don't know, some photographer. And then the same photographer comes back a month from now. Do you think I will remember exactly how I did it? Unless I have detailed notes for every little print.
I know. Well, especially in a dark room. I mean, we think about variables now. I mean, look at all the variables back then.
I made prints that required 6 minutes of exposure.
Yeah. And if your bulb's a little, I mean, what about the lifetime? Your bulb starts to diminish. You have to check to make sure that everything
the bulb is dimmer, right?
Yeah.
The light is different. The color of the light is different, which means that the perceived light radiation, perceived by the sensitive materials, is different. Therefore, you cannot say expose it for 2.5 minutes or 5 minutes and you'll get your print. No, because the bulb maybe went from 40 watts down to 30. Yeah. And it's redder. Therefore, it's not as blue as it would be required by the paper to sensitize. Kind of stuff like that.
And people complain, today that they have to calibrate their monitors. I mean, exactly. Cry me a river. Yeah. Calibrate your monitor every once in a while, please. It'll help us out.
And there are ways to do things now in Photoshop, for example, that if you have a background like I do, they're so intuitive, right? You know exactly what to do. Preserve a certain range of tones, but emphasize a certain range of tones on the other end, right? Mm-hmm. And you can isolate things, and for example, or you understand how to create better grayscales from color, right? Because you have all these tools that give you incredible options, right? So as a black and white photographer, which I still consider myself a black and white photographer, I look at this smorgasbord of fantastic tools as a godsend. I'm not one of those people who say, "Oh, there's nothing like film." No,
you don't want to be that stubborn curmudgeon. You don't want to be called boomer or any of the.
No,
the slang
I am of the baby boom generation, but
me too.
When it comes to innovation, I'm completely with it, 100%.
Yeah,
I've never been a nostalgic. Oh, the old days. No, not me. I've always moved forward, and that's what has propelled me all these years. This endless for me. It's an endless search for better ways to do things in my field of expertise, which is imaging, really. Now it's print and color, which is, it's strange. A person like me, trained in black and white, has become a color expert, but it's not that strange, actually, because the fundamentals of color have a lot to do with tonality and contrast, which are the backbone of G7. Well, Don defines it by saying that G7 brings RGB to CMYK. It's a good way to put it.
And
because in RGB, equal numbers in R, G, and B give you perfect neutrality, right?
Yes.
So G7 brings more or less perfect neutrality to CMYK.
There you go.
So,
well put.
Using the same core principles, which is find something that gives you the same contrast and the needed neutrality, right? And then you share the appearance. It doesn't matter where you print. There's something in common between all these prints, although the color might not be there. Of course, if you want color besides shared neutral appearance to match, then you have to do other things. You have to deal with differences in gamut, for example. You cannot expect the same results on an uncoated stock that you get from a glossy stock. But the appearance will be the same. Things will not look dramatically lighter or darker, dramatically more contrasty or less contrasty. They will all share those traits.
Well said, Marco. And we have been on for quite a while. And thank you so much. It was a joy to listen to your journey and your insights. And we so appreciate it. And thank you for joining us on the GAMUT podcast.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the GAMUT podcast. If you have ideas, suggestions, or would like to join us or even sponsor future podcasts, simply email me at jcollins@idealliance.org. That's JCOLLINS at idealliance.org. Take care and have a productive day.